The autumn light filtered through the Douglas firs of Forest Park like liquid amber, catching the copper highlights in Max's coat as he bounded ahead of Sarah on the winding trail. She raised her camera, a well-worn Canon that had seen better days, and captured the moment her golden retriever mid-leap over a fallen log, ears flying pure joy, radiating from every fiber of his being. Through the viewfinder, life made sense again. Sarah Chen lowered the camera and smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in weeks. 8 months since the layoff. 6 months since David, her ex-boyfriend, had decided that her emotional unavailability was too much to handle. 3 months since she'd stopped returning her mother's increasingly worried phone calls from Seattle. But here in this cathedral of evergreens, with Max as her congregation of one, the weight on her chest felt lighter. "Max, stay close," she called softly, though she knew he would. He always did. In the case of her unraveling life, Max remained her constant, the one being who looked at her each morning as if she hung the moon, who pressed his warm body against her legs during the 3 a.m. anxiety attacks, who somehow always knew when she needed him most. The dog trotted back to her side, tongue lolling, golden eyes bright with intelligence and something that looked remarkably like concern. Sarah reached down to scratch behind his ears, and he leaned into her touch with a contented sigh. "Just you and me against the world, buddy," she whispered. That's when they heard it, a sharp, desperate barking echoing from deeper in the forest. Not the playful yip of dogs at play, but something urgent, almost human in its distress. Max's head snapped up, ears pricked forward. He whined low in his throat, every muscle in his body suddenly taut with attention. "What is it, boy?" The barking came again, closer now, and Max bolted. "Max, Max, no." But he was already crashing through the underbrush, following some instinct Sarah couldn't understand. She stumbled after him, branches catching at her jacket, her camera bouncing against her chest. The trail split ahead, one path leading back toward the parking area, the other diving deeper into the park's wilderness. Sarah's heart hammered as she reached the fork and saw no sign of her dog. "Max," her voice echoed back empty. A jay scolded her from overhead. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the dull roar of traffic on Highway 30, but it might as well have been on another planet. She was alone. 3 miles away, Jake Morrison's hands were buried in the engine of a 1987 Toyota pickup when he heard the first bark. He paused, wrenched, suspended over the carburetor, and listened. The sound was faint but distinct, a dog in distress. Working in southeast Portland meant you heard a lot of things. Sirens at all hours. Domestic disputes from the apartment building next door. The late-night arguments of couples walking home from the bars on Division. But this was different. This was a sound Jake knew in his bones. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. At 35, Jake still moved with the careful economy of someone who'd spent years reading the forest for signs of trouble. Old habits from his ranger days died hard. The barking came again, and this time he was sure somewhere in Forest Park a dog was in serious trouble. Jake's jaw tightened. Not his problem, not anymore. He'd made that decision 2 years ago when he'd hung up his green uniform for the last time, when he'd realized that all his training, all his years of search and rescue experience, hadn't been enough to save them all. Sometimes the forest kept what it took, no matter how hard you fought to get it back. He ducked back under the hood of the pickup, but his hands had gone still on the wrench. The barking continued, growing more frantic. "God damn it," he muttered. Jake owned Morrison's garage, a 2-bay operation he'd inherited from his uncle, along with a mountain of debt and a customer base that paid more in promises than cash. It wasn't much, but it was honest work. Predictable work. Engines had problems you could diagnose and fix. They didn't vanish into the wilderness to die alone and afraid. The bell above the front door chimed, and Jake looked up to see Mrs. Dorothy Kim shuffling in with a plate covered in aluminum foil. The 70-year-old Korean woman owned Kim's Bakery 3 blocks down and had appointed herself the unofficial grandmother of the entire neighborhood. "You eat lunch today?" she asked without preamble, setting the plate on his workbench. "Morning, Mrs. Kim. And yeah, I grabbed something earlier." She gave him a look that suggested she could see right through his lie. "Blueberry muffins, still warm. You too skinny." Jake couldn't help but smile. Dorothy Kim had been feeding half of southeast Portland for 30 years, and she wasn't about to let a stubborn ex-ranger waste away on her watch. "Thanks, that's really kind of..." The barking echoed again, and this time Mrs. Kim heard it too. Her face went pale. "That sound," she whispered. "Just a dog. Probably lost." "No." Mrs. Kim's hands trembled as she reached for the edge of the workbench. "That's the same sound Benny made when—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Jake knew the story. Everyone in the neighborhood did. 2 years ago, Mrs. Kim's corgi had vanished during a walk in Forest Park. She'd searched for weeks, hired a pet detective, even consulted a psychic. Nothing. Benny had simply disappeared, leaving behind an old woman with a broken heart and a terrible conviction that her dog was still out there, somewhere waiting for her to find him. "Mrs. Kim, you have to help," she said, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "You know the forest. You know how to find what's lost." Jake gently extracted himself from her grasp. "I don't do that anymore. But you could, if you wanted to." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Jake turned back to the engine, but the barking seemed to follow him, burrowing under his skin like a splinter. "I'll call animal control," he said finally. "They have people trained for this kind of thing." Mrs. Kim made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Animal control. Yes, like they helped find Benny." She shuffled toward the door, then paused. "Some things you can't fix with a wrench, Jake Morrison. Some things need a heart that still remembers how to hope." The bell chimed as she left, and Jake was alone with the sound of his own breathing and the distant, desperate barking of a dog he'd never met. He tried to focus on the carburetor, but his hands kept shaking. 2 years. 2 years since he'd walked away from the forest and everything in it. 2 years since he'd decided that some risks weren't worth taking, some losses too great to bear. But as he stood there in the oil-stained quiet of his garage, Jake could feel something stirring in his chest, something he'd thought was safely buried. The sound of hope calling from the wilderness. Sarah had been calling Max's name for 20 minutes when she finally admitted she was lost. The trails of Forest Park wound through more than 5,000 acres of temperate rainforest, and in her panic to follow her dog, she'd taken wrong turn after wrong turn until the familiar landmarks had disappeared entirely. She stood at yet another trail junction, breathing hard, her voice already going hoarse. The October air was crisp enough to see her breath, and the light was beginning to slant low through the trees. In another hour, it would be dark. "Max," she called again, but the forest swallowed her voice. "Think, Sarah. Think like Max would think." But that was the problem. She had no idea how Max thought. For all the time they'd spent together, for all the ways he'd become her emotional lifeline over the past 8 months, she'd never really tried to understand the world through his eyes. She fed him, walked him, took pictures of him, but did she actually know him? The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so wrapped up in her own grief, her own sense of loss and failure, that she'd treated Max more like a therapy animal than a thinking, feeling creature with his own motivations and fears. What if he'd run because he'd sensed something she couldn't? What if he was trying to help something or someone? Sarah pulled out her phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen showed only one bar and no available networks. She tried calling 911 anyway, but the call failed before it could connect. Panic began to set in for real now, not just about Max, but about herself. How long before someone reported her missing? She lived alone, worked from home, had been increasingly isolated since the breakup. It could be days before anyone noticed she was gone. She thought about her mother in Seattle, probably wondering why her weekly check-in call hadn't come. About her small circle of friends who'd grown tired of her depression and stopped reaching out. About David, who'd told her she was disappearing into herself long before he'd finally given up trying to reach her. Maybe he'd been right. Maybe she had disappeared, and losing Max was just the final proof. Sarah sank down on a fallen log and put her head in her hands. The forest around her was beautiful, towering trees that had stood here since before Portland was even a dream, moss-covered rocks that looked like sleeping giants, the kind of natural cathedral that should have inspired awe. Instead, it felt like a maze with no exit, a green prison closing in around her. That's when she heard the footsteps, heavy boots on the trail moving with purpose and confidence. Sarah's head snapped up, relief flooding through her, so suddenly it made her dizzy. "Hello," she called out. "Hello, I need help." The footsteps paused, then changed direction. A moment later, a figure emerged from the trees. A tall man in work clothes with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "You okay?" he asked, his voice carrying out a slight accent Sarah couldn't place. My dog, she said, standing up so quickly she swayed. He ran off. I've been looking for him, but I got turned around and now I don't know where I am. The man studied her for a moment, and Sarah found herself cataloging details, the careful way he moved like someone accustomed to rough terrain, the calloused hands that spoke of manual labor, the way his eyes kept scanning the forest around them, as if he was reading something she couldn't see. How long ago, he asked. Maybe half an hour, 40 minutes. He heard something, another dog barking, I think, and just took off. Sarah knew she was babbling, but she couldn't seem to stop. He never runs away. Never. He's the most obedient dog in the world, but something just, I don't understand what happened. What kind of dog? Golden Retriever, 4 years old. His name is Max. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him the last photo she'd taken, Max mid-leap over the fallen log golden coat shining in the afternoon light. Something flickered across the man's face when he saw the picture. Recognition, concern. Before Sarah could identify it, the expression was gone. I'm Jake, he said. Jake Morrison. Sarah, Chen. She hesitated, then asked, do you know these trails? Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the photo on her phone and back again. Sarah had the strange feeling he was weighing something, making a decision that went far beyond helping a lost stranger find her dog. Yeah, he said finally, I know them. Jake led Sarah back to the main trail with the kind of automatic confidence that came from years of practice. His ranger training was like muscle memory. Read the terrain, identify landmarks, always know your way home. But with each step, he could feel the walls he'd carefully built around his past starting to crack. The golden retriever in the photo looked familiar. Not just the breed, but something specific about the eyes, the expression. It was the kind of face that stayed with you, especially if you'd seen it in circumstances that mattered. 2 years ago, the climbing accident on the eastern slopes of the park. A group of college kids who'd gotten in over their heads, caught by an early October storm that turned the rock face into a death trap. Jake had been part of the search and rescue team, along with his canine partner Rex, a German shepherd with an instinct for finding people that bordered on supernatural. They'd found 3 of the 4 climbers alive. The 4th, a young man named David Chen, had fallen into a ravine and hadn't been seen since. The search had gone on for 2 weeks before being officially called off, but Jake had continued looking on his own time, with Rex leading the way through terrain that seemed determined to keep its secrets. That's when they'd encountered the golden retriever. The dog had appeared on the 5th day of the extended search, thin and wild-eyed, but clearly not a stray. He'd been wearing a collar, though no tags, and had seemed desperate to lead them somewhere deeper into the wilderness. Rex had been agitated by the other dog's presence, and Jake had made the decision to focus on the official search grid rather than follow what might have been a distraction. 3 days later, Rex had been killed in a rock slide while pursuing a scent trail that led nowhere. The golden retriever had vanished the same day, and Jake had always wondered if the 2 events were connected, if the other dog had been trying to tell them something important that they'd been too focused to hear. The accident review had cleared Jake of any wrongdoing, but he'd known the truth, he'd made a choice, and people both human and canine had died because of it. He'd turned in his badge the following week and hadn't set foot in the wilderness since. Now, looking at the photo on Sarah's phone, Jake was almost certain he was looking at the same dog. Older, healthier, but definitely the same intelligent eyes that had seemed to be pleading with him 2 years ago. The parking area's this way, he said, pointing toward a side trail. We can call for help from there. Wait, Sarah caught his arm as he started to turn away. You said you know these trails. Would you help me look for him? I know it's a lot to ask, but I don't know anyone else, and he's all I have. The desperation in her voice was raw and familiar. Jake had heard it before from families waiting for news of missing loved ones, from fellow rangers who'd pushed themselves beyond exhaustion in search of the lost. It was the sound of someone staring into an abyss and realizing they might fall. I'm not a ranger anymore, he said. Haven't been for 2 years. But you were, and you know the forest. Jake looked down at the photo again. Max, if it was the same dog, stared back at him with those knowing eyes, and suddenly Jake could hear Rex's final bark echoing through the ravine, could feel the ground giving way beneath his partner's paws. Some dogs, he said slowly, they have instincts. If yours ran towards something, there might be a good reason. Sarah's eyes brightened with hope. So you'll help? Jake should have said no. Should have walked her to the parking area, helped her call animal control, and gone back to the safety of his garage where the worst thing that could happen was a stripped bolt or a seized engine. Instead, he found himself nodding. "We lose light in about an hour," he said. "If we're going to do this, we need to move fast." They backtracked to the spot where Sarah had last seen Max Jake moving with the methodical precision of someone reading a story written in disturbed earth and broken branches. Sarah watched him work, fascinated, despite her worry, by the way he seemed to communicate with the forest itself. "Here," he said, crouching beside a patch of soft ground. "Two sets of prints, your dog and something smaller." They were both moving fast. Sarah knelt beside him, trying to see what he saw in the confused tangle of paw prints and scuff marks. "The other dog. Looks like it. Small breed, maybe 25 pounds. The prints are old couple days at least, but your dog was definitely following this trail." Jake stood and studied the terrain ahead. The official trail curved left toward a scenic overlook, but an informal path, barely more than a game trail, led straight into the thick of the forest. "This is where we go off script," he said. "You sure you want to do this? It gets rough from here." Sarah thought about Max alone in the growing darkness, possibly injured, certainly scared. She thought about going home to her empty apartment, about the silence that would greet her, about trying to explain to people that she'd lost the one thing that made her life worth living. "I'm sure, Bishao." They pushed into the underbrush, Jake leading the way with Sarah close behind. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in the shade of the canopy, and the sounds of the city faded until all they could hear was their own breathing and the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. "So what happened 2 years ago?" Sarah asked as they navigated around a massive fallen cedar. "Why did you stop being a ranger?" Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he hadn't heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Lost someone I was supposed to find. Lost my partner, too. Decided I wasn't cut out for the work." "Your partner?" "K9, German Shepherd named Rex. Best tracking dog I ever worked with." There was a weight in his voice that Sarah recognized, the same heaviness she carried when people asked about her ex-boyfriend or her job situation. The sound of grief that had settled into the bones and made itself at home. "I'm sorry," she said. Jake nodded without turning around. "Rex would have found your dog by now. Probably would have found him before he ever got lost." They walked in silence for another 10 minutes, following the faint trail deeper into the forest. Sarah was beginning to wonder if they were chasing shadows when they heard it, a sharp bark from somewhere ahead, followed by an answering call from a different direction. Jake froze, holding up a hand for silence. The barking came again, and this time Sarah was sure she recognized one of the voices. "Max," she whispered, but Jake was shaking his head. "Two dogs definitely, but something's wrong." "What do you mean, the barking? It's not playful. They're agitated about something." As if summoned by his words, the barking erupted again, frantic, desperate, almost human in its urgency. Sarah started forward, but Jake caught her arm. "Careful. If they're upset about something, we need to know what we're walking into." They moved forward more slowly now, Jake's hand resting on Sarah's shoulder to keep her from rushing ahead. The barking grew louder, more insistent, and soon they could hear other sounds, whimpering, the scratch of claws on stone, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush. The trees opened into a small clearing, dominated by a rocky outcropping that rose about 15 feet above the forest floor. At the base of the rocks, Sarah could see a flash of golden fur. "Max," but even as she called his name, Sarah could see that something was wrong. Max was pacing back and forth at the bottom of the rocks, whining and barking up at something she couldn't see. And he wasn't alone. A smaller dog, a corgi with a coat gone wild and matted, was beside him, exhibiting the same agitated behavior. Both animals looked thin, almost feral, but very much alive. "Benny," Jake whispered. Sarah stared at him. "You know that dog?" Before Jake could answer, Max spotted them. He bounded towards Sarah with a joy that nearly knocked her over. But even as she buried her face in his fur and felt the overwhelming relief of finding him safe, she could hear him whimpering. He kept looking back toward the rocks, as if trying to tell her something urgent. Jake was already studying the rock face, his expression grim. "Someone's up there," he said. Jake had seen enough rescue situations to recognize the signs, the way the dogs were positioned, their behavior, the urgency in their calls. Someone was on that rock face, probably injured, possibly trapped. Stay with the dumb, he told Sarah, already moving toward the base of the outcropping. Jake, wait. But he was already climbing his hands, finding holds in the granite with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this countless times before. The rock was slippery with moss and recent rain, but stable enough to support his weight. About 12 feet up, he found what the boys had been trying to show them. A narrow ledge barely 3 feet wide where someone had built a crude shelter from branches and salvaged plastic sheeting. The shelter was old months, maybe longer, and partially collapsed, but clearly human-made. Inside, Jake could see the remnants of a sleeping area, some scattered belongings, and what looked like a cache of canned goods. But no person. "Hello," he called. "Anyone there? We're here to help." The only response was the echo of his own voice off the rocks. Jake climbed higher, checking every ledge and crevice, but the shelter appeared to be abandoned. He was about to climb down when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A piece of fabric caught on a sharp edge of rock about 20 feet higher up. The fabric was faded and weathered, but he could still make out the logo, University of Oregon Outdoor Club. The same club that David Chen had belonged to. Jake's hands began to shake as he carefully worked his way up to the fabric. When he reached it, he found more than just cloth. There was a small metal clip attached, the kind used to secure climbing gear. And carved into the rock beside it, so faint he almost missed it, were 3 letters DC, David Chen, the missing climber from 2 years ago. Jake looked down at the shelter, seeing it with new eyes. Someone had survived the fall, had made it this far, had lived here for God knew how long. But where were they now, Jake? Sarah's voice carried up from below. The dogs are acting strange again. I think they want us to follow them. Jake pocketed the fabric and the clip, his mind racing. If David Chen had survived, if he'd been living wild in the forest for 2 years, where would he be now, and why had the dogs brought them here? He climbed down quickly, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Sarah was waiting at the bottom with Max and the corgi Benny. Jake was now certain, both dogs pacing restlessly at the edge of the clearing. "What did you find?" Sarah asked. Jake showed her the fabric and the clip. Someone was living up there, recently by the look of it, but they're gone now. Living up there for how long? Hard to say. Could be months, maybe longer. Max barked sharply and trotted toward the far side of the clearing, looking back at them expectantly. Benny fell into step beside him, and together the 2 dogs began to move deeper into the forest. "They want us to follow," Sarah said. Jake nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, trying to piece together a puzzle that had been the 2 years in the making. If David Chen had survived, if these dogs had somehow found him, then everything Jake thought he knew about that day was wrong. Everything about Rex's death, about his own failures, about the search that had ended in tragedy, all of it might need to be rewritten. As they followed the dogs deeper into the wilderness, Jake found himself hoping for something he'd thought was lost forever, the chance to set things right. The chance to save someone he'd failed to find. The dogs led them along what couldn't generously be called a trail, more like a suggestion in the undergrowth marked by broken branches and the occasional paw print in patches of soft earth. Jake moved with the fluid confidence of someone reading a language Sarah didn't know existed, while she stumbled along behind, trying not to think about how far they'd traveled from any recognizable landmark. The October afternoon was dying around them, painting the forest in shades of amber and shadow. In another hour, maybe less, they'd be navigating by moonlight. Sarah had never been afraid of the dark, but the thought of spending the night in the wilderness with only Jake's questionable protection sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Max padded alongside Benny with an ease that suggested this wasn't their first journey together. Watching them, Sarah realized her dog had been living a completely separate life, one she knew nothing about. How many times had he slipped away during their walks to visit his small wild friend? How many secrets did he carry behind those knowing golden eyes? "They've done this before," she said, voicing her thoughts. Jake glanced back at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Dogs form packs. It's natural for them to establish territories, regular routes. If Benny's been living wild for 2 years, Max probably stumbled onto his territory and they worked out some kind of arrangement. But Max always came home, because he had a home to come back to. There was something in Jake's voice, a note of longing, that made Sarah look at him more closely. She'd been so focused on her own crisis that she hadn't really considered what this might mean for him. A former park ranger searching the wilderness again after 2 years away. Whatever had driven him from this work, it had left scars. "Tell me about Rex," she said softly. Jake's stride faltered almost imperceptibly. "Why does Because you loved him, and because you blame yourself for what happened to him." They walked in silence for several minutes before Jake spoke again. "Rex was smarter than most people I've worked with. Had an instinct for reading terrain, weather, human behavior. Could track a scent trail that was 3 days old through a rainstorm." "How long were you partners?" "5 years, since he was barely more than a puppy." Jake's voice carried the weight of old grief. "I trained him myself. We worked search and rescue all over the Pacific Northwest. Avalanche victims, lost hikers, missing kids. Rex saved more lives than I can count." "What happened?" Jake stopped walking so abruptly that Sarah nearly collided with him. Ahead of them, the dogs had paused at the edge of what looked like a steep ravine, both animals whining and pacing with agitation. "This is it," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah moved to stand beside him and looked down into the ravine. It was deeper than she'd expected, maybe 30 feet to the bottom, with steep, rocky sides and a small stream running through it. The sound of water over stones created a constant whisper that seemed to muffle all other sounds. "This is where Rex died." Jake's hands were clenched at his sides. "We were tracking someone down there. David Chen, the missing climber. Rex had picked up a scent trail, was moving fast, confident. I should have called him back when I saw how unstable the rock was, but the trail was hot and we were running out of time." Max and Benny had found a way down into the ravine, a narrow deer path that switched back along the eastern wall. Both dogs were already halfway to the bottom, moving with purpose. "The rock slide happened fast," Jake continued. "One second Rex was there, the next he was buried under half a ton of granite. By the time I dug him out," Jake's voice broke. "By the time I got to him, it was too late." Sarah reached out instinctively and touched his arm. "I'm sorry. The worst part is, we never found Chen. Rex died for nothing." "Jake." Sarah turned to face him fully. "Look at me." He met her eyes reluctantly, and she saw the depth of pain he'd been carrying. It was familiar territory, the weight of failure, the conviction that you'd let down the one being who'd depended on you most. "Rex didn't die for nothing if we're here now," she said. "If there's even a chance that David Chen is still alive, then Rex's trail led us to the right place. Just 2 years too late." From the bottom of the ravine, Max barked sharply. Both dogs were standing beside something Sarah couldn't make out from their vantage point, a dark shape against the lighter stone of the creek bed. "We have to go down there," she said. Jake was already studying the deer path, his ranger training taking over despite his emotional state. "It's risky. Those rocks shift if you put weight on them wrong. One mistake, and we're both at the bottom with broken bones." "The dogs made it." "Dogs weigh a lot less than people." Sarah looked down at Max, who was staring up at them with an expression that seemed almost human in its urgency. Whatever was down there, it was important enough that he'd risked his own safety to reach it. "I'm going," she said, "with or without you." The descent took 20 minutes of careful navigation, with Jake leading the way and calling out warnings about loose rocks and unstable footing. Sarah's hands were scraped raw by the time they reached the bottom, but she barely noticed. All her attention was focused on the dark shape the dogs had been guarding. It was a backpack, weather-beaten and partially buried under debris from the rock slide, but definitely human-made. Jake reached it first, brushing away stones and mud with careful hands. "University of Oregon," he read from a faded patch on the back panel. "David Chen." Sarah felt her heart skip. So he was here, after the accident. Jake was already opening the pack, his movements efficient and professional. Inside, they found the remnants of survival supplies, water purification tablets, emergency rations, a first aid kit that had been partially used. At the bottom of the pack was a waterproof pouch containing a journal wrapped in plastic. Jake hesitated before opening it. "This feels like violating someone's privacy." "Jake, if David Chen is still alive out there, this might be the only way to find him." The journal was written in careful handwriting, each entry dated. Jake flipped to the first page and read aloud. "October 15th, 2022. Fell approximately 30 feet. Left leg definitely broken, possible concussion. Made it to this ravine but can't climb out. Water source here, some shelter under the overhang. If anyone finds this, I tried to make it home." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Keep reading. Jake turned pages, carefully scanning the entries. October 18th, leg getting infected. Fever comes and goes. Found some wild berries, but not enough food. Saw a dog today, golden retriever. Seemed friendly, but wouldn't come close enough to touch. Max, Sarah whispered. He found David 3 days after the accident. October 22nd, the dog came back, brought a friend, smaller, looks like a corgi. They seem to understand I need help. The golden one brought me a stick today, like he wanted to play. First time I've smiled since the fall. Jake's voice was growing rougher with each entry. Sarah could see the guilt and regret warring in his expression as he realized how close they'd come to saving David Chen. November 2nd, dogs visit every day now. The corgi brought me part of a sandwich still wrapped in plastic. There must be people nearby. I've been trying to signal with my whistle, but no response. Starting to think the dogs are my only connection to the world. Keep going, Sarah urged. November 15th, infection finally clearing up. Leg healing, crooked but functional. Been working on building a shelter upstream where it's more protected. The dogs showed me a way up the east wall, steep but possible. Tomorrow I'm going to try to climb out. Jake flipped through several more pages. The entries became less frequent, but they painted a picture of a man learning to survive with the help of two unlikely companions. David had eventually made it out of the ravine, had built the shelter they'd found earlier, had been living wild in the forest for almost 2 years. Here, Jake said, pointing to an entry from just a month ago. September 20th, winter coming again. Third one out here, the dogs are getting older, the corgi especially seems tired. We've been spending more time at the old camp near the big rocks. If something happens to me, I hope someone finds this journal and knows that I tried to make it home. Tell my family I thought about them every day. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks earlier. October 10th, heard voices in the forest today. Sounded like searchers, but when I tried to call out, my voice wouldn't work right. Been alone too long, maybe. The dogs understand me, but I'm forgetting how to talk to people. Tomorrow we're moving deeper into the hills, too dangerous to stay near the trails with hunting season starting. Jake closed the journal carefully. He's still alive, and he's been living with PTSD for 2 years completely alone except for our dogs. Our dogs, Max and Benny, they've been taking care of him. Probably saved his life a dozen times over. Sarah looked at Max and Benny, who were sitting patiently nearby, as if waiting for the humans to catch up to what they already knew. They brought us here. They wanted us to find this. But David's not here anymore. He moved deeper into the hills. As if responding to his words, Max stood up and trotted toward the far end of the ravine where the creek disappeared around a bend. He looked back at them expectantly. He wants us to follow, Sarah said. Jake checked his watch. We've got maybe an hour of light left. If we go any further, we're committed to spending the night out here. Sarah thought about her warm apartment, her comfortable bed, the safety and predictability of her controlled little world. Then she looked at Max, who had risked everything to lead them to this point. David Chen has been out here for 2 years, she said. One more night won't kill us. Jake nodded slowly. Okay, but we do this smart. We mark our trail, we conserve body heat, and we turn back at the first sign of real danger. Agreed. As they gathered their things and prepared to follow the dogs deeper into the wilderness, Sarah realized that somewhere in the last few hours, her perspective had shifted completely. This wasn't just about finding her lost pet anymore. It was about finding a lost person, about completing a rescue that should have happened 2 years ago. It was about the kind of second chances that came along once in a lifetime if you were brave enough to take them. They followed the creek for another mile as darkness settled over the forest like a heavy blanket. Jake had produced a small LED flashlight from his jacket at Ranger habits, dying hard, but he used it sparingly, sweeping the beam ahead only when necessary to avoid obstacles. The dogs moved like shadows in front of them, sure-footed and silent. Sarah marveled at how different Max seemed out here, no longer the comfortable house pet she'd known, but something wilder, more purposeful. Benny had accepted their presence with the wariness of an animal that had learned to survive on its own, but he clearly trusted Max's judgment about these strange humans. There, Jake said softly, pointing ahead with his flashlight. In the distance, Sarah could see the faint glow of a fire. Not a wildfire, too small, too contained, but definitely man-made. The dogs had stopped about 50 yards away from the light, both of them lying down in the undergrowth with their ears pricked forward. "David," Sarah whispered. "Has to be." Jake turned off the flashlight and motioned for her to crouch down beside him. "But we approach carefully. He's been alone for 2 years. He might not react well to strangers." They crept forward slowly, using the sound of the creek to mask their footsteps. As they got closer, Sarah could make out more details. A small campfire built in a ring of stones, a lean-to shelter constructed from branches and salvaged materials, and a figure sitting motionless beside the flames. The figure was thin to the point of gauntness, with long hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. He was wearing layers of mismatched clothing, some of it clearly scavenged, some of it remnants of hiking gear. In the firelight, his eyes looked wild and unfocused, but he was alive. Max and Benny approached the camp with obvious familiarity, both dogs going directly to the man and settling down on either side of him. He reached out to pet them with the automatic gesture of someone who'd performed this ritual thousands of times. "Hello, boys," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "Find anything interesting today?" Sarah's heart clenched at the loneliness in those words. David Chen had been carrying on conversations with two dogs for 2 years, and they might be the only reason he'd maintained any connection to human speech at all. Jake stood up slowly, his hands visible and open. "David Chen." The man's head snapped up, his entire body going rigid. In the firelight, Sarah could see the panic in his eyes, the look of a wild animal caught in headlights. "Who's there?" David's voice cracked. "How do you know my name?" "My name is Jake Morrison. I was one of the rangers who searched for you 2 years ago." Jake's voice was calm, professional, designed not to spook someone who was clearly on the edge. "This is Sarah Chen, no relation. We've been looking for you." "Looking for me?" David laughed, but it was a broken sound. "Why, I'm dead, remember. Search called off. Case closed." Sarah stood up slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Because Max and Benny brought us to you. They wanted us to find you." At the mention of the dogs' names, David's expression shifted slightly. "You know their names?" "Max is mine," Sarah said softly. "He's been living with me, but apparently he's been visiting you too. And Benny belongs to Mrs. Dorothy Kim. She's been looking for him for 2 years. Something broke in David's face. "Mrs. Kim, the lady from the bakery. You know her. Before the accident, I used to stop at her bakery sometimes. She always had treats for Benny." David's voice was getting stronger, more human. "Benny's been my companion out here. I never knew someone was looking for him." Jake took a careful step closer. "David, there are a lot of people who've been looking for you too. Your family, your friends from the climbing club. They never stopped hoping." David's hands were shaking now, whether from emotion or the cold, Sarah couldn't tell. "I wanted to come back. In the beginning, I tried. But then winter came and I was hurt, and by the time I was strong enough to travel," he gestured helplessly. "I'd been gone so long, everyone thought I was dead. I started to think maybe it was better that way." "It's not better," Sarah said firmly. "It's never better. People who love you don't stop loving you just because you have been gone. You don't understand." David's voice rose slightly, panic creeping back in. "I'm not the same person who fell off that cliff. I don't know how to be around people anymore. I talk to dogs better than humans. I forget what day it is, what month it is. Sometimes I forget my own name." Jake sat down slowly, making himself less threatening. "David, do you know what PTSD is? Post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah, I know what it is. What you're describing, the isolation, the confusion, the difficulty connecting with people, those are symptoms. They don't make you broken. They make you human." Sarah found herself sitting down, too drawn into the circle of firelight. Max came over to her, immediately pressing his warm body against her side, but his attention remained focused on David. "These dogs," she said, "they've been taking care of you, but they've also been taking care of other people. Max has been my lifeline for the past 8 months. He's the reason I get up in the morning and the reason I leave my apartment. And Benny, Mrs. Kim talks about him every day. She lights a candle for him every night." David's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant for anyone to worry. I couldn't find my way back." "That's okay," Jake said gently. We're here now. We can help you find your way." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the trees around the small camp. Sarah realized that this moment, sitting in the wilderness with a man who'd been lost for 2 years, while two dogs who'd bridged the gap between worlds watched over them all, was probably the most important conversation of her life. "What happens now?" David asked finally. "Now," Jake said, "we go home. All of us. Together." They spent the night at David's camp, taking turns keeping the fire alive while the temperature dropped toward freezing. Sarah had never slept outdoors before, and she'd expected it to be miserable, cold, uncomfortable, frightening. Instead, she found an unexpected peace in the rhythm of the forest at night, the sound of the creek running over stones, the warmth of Max's body pressed against her back. Jake had given David his jacket and taken the first watch, sitting beside the fire and feeding it small branches while the others slept. Sarah dozed fitfully, waking every hour or so to find him still there, silhouetted against the flames like some ancient guardian. Around 3 in the morning, she woke to find David sitting up staring into the fire with the hollow expression of someone wrestling with invisible demons. "Can't sleep either," she whispered. He shook his head. "Haven't slept well in 2 years. Every time I close my eyes, I'm falling again." Sarah understood that feeling, the way trauma could trap you in a single moment, playing it over and over until it became more real than the present. What was it like, the fall? David was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the crackling fire. "We were almost at the top when the storm hit. The rock face got slippery, and I was the least experienced climber in the group. I should have turned back, but I didn't want to be the one who quit." He laughed bitterly. "Pride. Such a stupid reason to almost die. But you didn't die. Sometimes I think it would have been easier if I had." David looked at her directly for the first time since they'd found him. "Do you know what it's like to be completely alone for 2 years? To have conversations with dogs because you've forgotten how to talk to people?" Sarah thought about her apartment, her isolation since the breakup and job loss, the way she'd been disappearing into herself long before Max went missing. "I think I do, actually. Maybe not to the same extent, but yeah, I think I understand." "How do you come back from that? How do you rejoin a world that's moved on without you?" It was the same question Sarah had been asking herself for months. How do you rebuild a life after it falls apart? How do you trust people again after you've been let down? How do you believe in the future when the present feels impossible? "I don't know," she said honestly, "but maybe that's something we figure out together." Jake stirred from where he'd been dozing against a tree. "Sorry, didn't mean to eavesdrop, but Sarah's right. Recovery isn't something you do alone." "Easy for you to say," David replied. "You have a life to go back to." "Do I?" Jake's voice was sharp with his own pain. "I quit my job, isolated myself, spent 2 years convinced I was a failure who got his partner killed. I haven't exactly been living my best life either." David studied Jake's face in the firelight. "Rex, that was your dog's name, wasn't it? I remember hearing you calling for him that day." Jake nodded, unable to speak. "He was looking for me when he died. He was doing his It's not your fault." "And the fall wasn't your fault either," David said quietly. "Sometimes bad things just happen. Sometimes the rock gives way and you fall, and all you can do is try to survive the landing." They sat in silence for a while, 3 damaged people and 2 dogs who'd somehow found each other in the vast wilderness of their own isolation. Sarah realized that this strange midnight conversation beside a campfire was the first time in months that she'd felt genuinely connected to other human beings. "What's the first thing you want to do when we get back?" she asked David. He thought for a longer moment. "Call my parents. Tell them I'm sorry. Then maybe go to Mrs. Kim's bakery and apologize for keeping Benny away from her for so long." "She's going to cry," Sarah warned him. "Good tears or bad tears. The best tears, the kind that happen when something you thought was lost forever comes home." As dawn began to filter through the trees, painting the forest in shades of gold and green, they started the long journey back to civilization. David moved slowly. 2 years of malnutrition and isolation had taken their toll, but he moved with purpose. Jake had radioed for a medical team to meet them at the trailhead, and Sarah had called Mrs. Kim to prepare her for Benny's return. But as they walked, Sarah realized the most important thing that was returning wasn't a missing person or a lost dog. It was hope. The knowledge that even when you're lost in the deepest wilderness, literal or metaphorical, there are guides who can lead you home. Sometimes those guides have four legs and wet noses. Sometimes they're strangers who become something more important. Sometimes they're the parts of yourself you thought were gone forever. As they reached the final bend before the parking area, Sarah could see the ambulance waiting along with Mrs. Kim's small figure pressed against the window of Jake's garage. The old woman had her hands pressed to the glass, tears streaming down her face as she watched Benny trot toward her on his short legs. "Ready?" Jake asked David. David Chen looked at the scene ahead, the medical team, the tearful reunion, the first steps back into a world he'd been hiding from for 2 years. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and nodded. "Ready." The scene at Morrison's garage was something out of a movie. If movies were written by people who understood that the most powerful moments happen quietly without orchestral swells or dramatic speeches. Mrs. Dorothy Kim sat on the ground with Benny in her lap, both of them trembling. The elderly woman's tears had soaked into the corgi's matted fur as she whispered to him in a mixture of English and Korean, her hands checking every inch of his small body as if to convince herself he was real. "My Benny," she kept saying, "my sweet Benny, where have you been?" David Chen stood nearby, supported by two paramedics who were trying to convince him to lie down on the stretcher. But his attention was completely focused on the reunion between Mrs. Boz, Kim and her dog, his own eyes bright with tears. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice rough but gaining strength. "Mrs. Kim," she looked up at him, not immediately recognizing the gaunt, bearded man who bore little resemblance to the clean-cut college student who used to visit her bakery. "I'm David Chen. I've been taking care of Benny. He saved my life." Recognition dawned slowly across her face. "David, the boy from the university. But they said you were dead." "I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I kept him from you. But he found me after my accident, and we took care of each other." Mrs. Kim stood up slowly, still holding Benny, and walked over to David. For a moment, Sarah thought the old woman might be angry. 2 years of grief and searching, all because this young man had been too afraid or too broken to come home. Instead, Mrs. Kim reached out and touched David's cheek with her free hand. "You look terrible," she said matter-of-factly. "Too skinny. Come to the bakery tomorrow. I make you food." David broke down completely, then sobbing with the kind of grief that comes when someone offers you kindness you don't think you deserve. One of the paramedics moved to comfort him, but Mrs. Kim was faster somehow, managing to hug both David and Benny at the same time. "Shh," she said, the same tone she might use with a crying child. "You're home now, both of you." Jake watched the scene from beside his garage, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself apart from the emotional reunion happening just 20 feet away. "You should be proud," she said, moving to stand beside him. "You found him. After 2 years, you finally found him." "We found him, Jake corrected. "And it was the dogs who did the real work. I just followed." "Don't do that." "Don't do what?" "Don't minimize what you did. Don't talk yourself out of feeling good about this." Sarah turned to face him fully. 2 years ago, you lost someone you were trying to save. Today, you saved someone who was lost. That matters. Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching as the paramedics finally convinced David to lie down so they could examine him properly. "Rex would have found him in a day," he said finally. "Maybe, but Rex isn't here. You are. And you're the one who read the signs, who knew where to look, who got us safely through the forest in the dark." Sarah reached out and touched his arm. "You're the one who brought David Chen home." Something shifted in Jake's expression, not quite peace, but maybe the beginning of it. The kind of acceptance that comes when you realize that being human means failing sometimes, but it also means getting second chances if you're brave enough to take them. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah looked at Max, who was lying contentedly at her feet, showing no signs of wanting to bolt back into the wilderness. "Now we figure out how to move forward, all of us." 3 days later, Sarah found herself sitting in Mrs. Kim's bakery at 7 in the morning, watching the elderly woman fuss over David Chen like he was a long-lost grandson. In the past 72 hours, David had been thoroughly examined by doctors, malnourished but surprisingly healthy, debriefed by search and rescue teams. His survival story was already becoming legendary, and reunited with his family. His parents had driven down from Seattle within hours of getting the call. But every morning he came to Kim's bakery, and every morning Mrs. Kim fed him like he might disappear again if she didn't keep him properly nourished. Eat more, she was saying, now setting a plate of Korean pastries in front of him. You still too skinny. David smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him. Mrs. Kim, if I eat any more, I won't be able to fit through the door. Good, then you can't run away again. I'm not running anywhere. I promise. Jake appeared in the doorway looking slightly uncomfortable in the cozy domestic scene. He'd been avoiding the post-rescue attention, declining interview requests, and politely deflecting praise from local news outlets who wanted to make him a hero. Morning, he said, accepting the cup of coffee Ms. Kim pressed into his hands. How's the patient today? Gaining weight and getting his strength back, David replied. The doctors want me to start therapy next week, PTSD counseling. That's good, Sarah said. It helps to talk to someone who understands. What about you, David asked her. You mentioned the other night that you'd been dealing with some stuff too. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. In the aftermath of finding David, her own problems seemed almost trivial. Nothing like what you've been through. Trauma isn't a competition, Jake said quietly. Just because someone else has it worse doesn't mean your pain doesn't matter. Mrs. Kim set down her coffee pot with a decisive thunk. You all sad, she announced. All three of you, walking around like ghosts. You think I don't see, but I see everything. She pointed at David. You hiding in forest like wild animal instead of coming home to people who love you. Her finger swung to Jake. You hiding in garage fixing cars instead of fixing your own heart. Finally, she turned to Sarah. And you hiding in an apartment with only dog for company, too scared to trust people again. The three of them stared at her, caught off guard by her blunt assessment. But, Mrs. Kim continued, you find each other. You help each other. Maybe that's no accident. She bustled back to the kitchen, leaving them sitting in slightly stunned silence. She's not wrong, David said finally. About the hiding, I mean. I've been using the wilderness as an excuse to avoid dealing with what happened, telling myself I was too damaged to come back. And I've been using guilt as an excuse to avoid taking risks, Jake added, convinced myself that if I didn't care about anything, I couldn't lose anything. Sarah felt their eyes on her and realized it was her turn for honesty. I've been using depression as an excuse to stop trying. Easier to blame my ex-boyfriend or my old job than to admit I was afraid of putting myself out there again. So what do we do about it? David asked. Jake was staring out the window at the morning traffic on Division Street. I've been thinking about that, actually, about what comes next. And the Forest Service has been trying to recruit me back for the past year. They've got a new search and rescue program starting up, working with therapy dogs to help with wilderness recovery. Sarah felt something flutter in her chest, hope maybe, or possibility. Are you going to do it? I'm thinking about it, but I'd want to do it right this time. With a partner I trust. He looked directly at Sarah as he said it, and she felt her breath catch. Jake, I'm not a ranger. I don't know anything about search and rescue. But you know about healing, you know about loss and recovery, and you have the best tracking dog I've ever worked with. Jake's voice was serious, professional, but Sarah could hear something else underneath it, something that made her pulse quicken. Max isn't trained for search and rescue. No, but he's got the instincts for it, and instincts can be trained. The question is whether you're interested in learning. Sarah looked at Max, who was sleeping peacefully beside Benny near the bakery's front window. 3 days ago, she'd been convinced her life was falling apart. Now she was being offered a chance to rebuild it into something she'd never imagined. What about you? She asked David. What are your plans? David smiled, and Sarah realized how much younger he looked when he wasn't carrying the weight of 2 years isolation. Physical therapy counseling, getting back to school to finish my degree. But I was also thinking, he paused, looking slightly embarrassed. Mrs. Kim mentioned she could use help in the bakery, someone to handle the early morning baking while she focuses on the business side. You want to be a baker? I want to do something that helps people, something that creates instead of destroys. And I like the idea of feeding people, making sure they're taken care of. He glanced toward the kitchen where Mrs. Kim was humming over a batch of fresh muffins. She saved my life, you know. Her and Benny, if they hadn't shown me that kindness still existed in the world. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Plus, he added with a grin, she already threatened to adopt me if I don't take the job. From the kitchen came Mrs. Kim's voice. I hear everything. Job starts Monday. They laughed then, all three of them, and Sarah realized it was the first time she genuinely laughed in months. Not the polite laughter of social obligation, but the real thing, spontaneous, and healing, and full of possibility. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood at the edge of Forest Park with Max at her side wearing brand new hiking boots and a pack filled with search and rescue training materials. Jake was beside her, looking more relaxed than she had seen him since they'd met, wearing his Forest Service uniform for the first time in 2 years. You sure about this? He asked, adjusting the straps on his own pack. No, Sarah said honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. They were starting small, basic navigation training, learning to read terrain and weather signs, understanding how search dogs work. Jake had connections with a K9 training facility in Oregon City, and Max would begin his formal education as a search and rescue dog the following week. He'll be good at it, Jake said, watching Max investigate an interesting scent at the base of a Douglas fir. He's got the drive for it, and he's already proven he can find lost souls. Is that what we are, lost souls? Jake considered the question seriously. We're past tense. I think we're something else now. What's that, found? They started up the trail together, moving easily through terrain that had seemed threatening and alien just 2 weeks earlier. Sarah marveled at how different the forest felt now, not a maze to be escaped, but a place of possibility, of second chances, of things that had been lost being found again. Her phone buzzed with a text from David, first day at bakery going well. Mrs. Kim only yelled at me twice. Benny is excellent quality control supervisor. She showed the message to Jake, who smiled. He's going to be okay. We all are, I think. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, following a trail that led deeper into the park. Sarah found herself thinking about the night they'd spent around the campfire with David, about the conversation that had changed everything. Sometimes the most important moments in your life happened when you weren't expecting them, in places you'd never planned to be, with people you'd never imagined meeting. Jake, she said as they paused at a scenic overlook, can I ask you something? Sure. That night in the forest when we were talking about second chances, did you mean just professional second chances, or? She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. They'd been dancing around something for 2 weeks now, a connection that went beyond their shared mission, to find David, beyond their mutual commitment to healing and moving forward. But neither of them had been brave enough to name it. Jake set down his pack and turned to face her fully. Sarah, I meant every kind of second chance there is. Even the scary kind, especially the scary kind. Max chose that moment to come bounding back to them, tail wagging a stick in his mouth that he clearly wanted them to throw. He dropped it at their feet and looked up at them expectantly, head tilted to one side in the universal dog expression for, "Why aren't you playing with me?" Sarah laughed and picked up the stick. What do you think, Max? Should we take some risks? Max barked once, sharp and encouraging. I think that's a yes, Jake said. Sarah threw the stick, watching Max race after it with pure joy. When she turned back to Jake, he was closer than he'd been before, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. For the record, he said softly, I think Rex would have approved of you. Yeah, he always was a good judge of character. When Jake kissed her, it was gentle and careful and full of promise. Sarah felt something in her chest that had been tightly wound for months finally begin to loosen. Not the desperate relief of someone clinging to a lifeline, but the quiet confidence of someone who'd found solid ground. Max returned with his stick and sat down beside them, panting happily. He looked up at the two humans who'd become so important to his world and seemed to nod his approval. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the city traffic construction, the ordinary noise of people going about their daily lives. But here in this pocket of wilderness, where lost things could be found and broken hearts could heal, the future felt full of possibility. 6 months later, the sound of the radio crackling to life at 5:47 a.m. had become as familiar as breathing. Sarah rolled over in bed, instantly alert, while Max lifted his head from his spot on the floor and pricked his ears forward. Search Team Alpha, we have a missing hiker in Sector 7. Male, 63 years old, last seen on the Wildwood Trail yesterday evening. Response requested. Sarah was already reaching for her gear bag before Jake finished responding to the call. 6 months of training had made the routine automatic gear check, route planning, equipment distribution. Max was on his feet and moving toward his search vest before she'd even called his name. "Another one," Jake asked, pulling on his uniform shirt. "Looks like it. But hey," Sarah said, clipping Max's GPS collar around his neck, "at least this time we know what we're doing." In the past 6 months, their team had successfully located 12 missing persons. Not all happy endings wilderness rescue was a sobering reminder that nature didn't always give back what it took, but enough success to justify the program and secure funding for another year. More importantly for Sarah, it had been 6 months of discovering that she was capable of things she'd never imagined. She'd rappelled down cliff faces navigated by compass through zero visibility fog, performed CPR on a hypothermic teenager until the medical team arrived. She'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was doing the necessary thing while terrified. And she'd learned that healing wasn't a destination, but a process, something you worked at every day with people who understood the journey. "Ready, partner?" Jake asked, shouldering his pack. "Ready." They drove to the trailhead in Jake's truck, Max riding in the back, with his head out the window, alert and eager. The missing hiker was a retiree from California who'd been visiting Portland with his wife. Experienced outdoorsman, but unfamiliar with the specific terrain. The weather had been clear when he'd started his hike, but fog had rolled in during the night. "Classic scenario," Jake said as they reviewed the search grid. "Probably got turned or around in the fog, went off trail trying to find a landmark. He's likely within a mile of the main trail, just can't see well enough to navigate." They'd worked enough cases now that Sarah had developed her own theories about how people got lost. It was rarely one big mistake, but rather a series of small ones, wrong turns compounded by poor visibility, fatigue clouding judgment, pride preventing someone from admitting they needed help until it was too late. Kind of like life, really. Max picked up the scent trail within 20 minutes, his nose working the ground with a focused intensity that still amazed Sarah. He'd taken to search and rescue work like he'd been born for it, though Sarah suspected his success had as much to do with his natural empathy as his training. Max seemed to understand on some fundamental level that his job was to help lost things find their way home. They found the hiker 2 hours later, sitting beside a small creek with a sprained ankle and a sheepish expression. He was cold and dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed, and pathetically grateful to see Max's wagging tail emerge from the morning fog. "Best sight I've seen in 12 hours, he said, as Sarah checked his vitals and Jake radioed for a medical evacuation. "Max does have that effect on people," Sarah said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "He's kind of a specialist in showing up when people need him most." As they waited for the evacuation team, Sarah found herself thinking about David, who would probably be opening the bakery right about now. He'd been working for Mrs. Kim for 6 months, and the partnership had proved beneficial for both of them. David had a natural talent for baking, and Mrs. Kim had someone she could fuss over and feed properly. Benny spent his days supervising the operation from a comfortable bed behind the counter, accepting treats and praise from customers who remembered his story. David had also started a support group for people dealing with wilderness trauma hikers and climbers who'd survived accidents or gotten lost and struggled with the psychological aftermath. It met every Thursday evening in the back room of the bakery, and Mrs. Kim provided food for the meetings because, as she put it, people heal better when they're not hungry. "Sarah," Jake said, interrupting her thoughts, "evac team's here." They handed the hiker over to the medical team and began the hike back to the trailhead. Max trotted between them, tired but satisfied with a job well done. At the truck, Jake pulled out a tennis ball and threw it for Max while Sarah updated their case log. 12 for 12 this month, she said, reviewing the statistics. Not bad for a former graphic designer and her untrained dog. "Hey," Jake said, mock offense in his voice. "What about the formerly washed-up ranger? You were never washed up, just temporarily misplaced." Jake caught the ball that Max brought back and threw it again. "You know what I like about this work?" "What's that?" "Every case has the potential for a happy ending. Every time we go out there, we might be the reason someone makes it home." Sarah looked at him, really looked. The man who'd been so careful and guarded 6 months ago, who'd convinced himself that caring too much led to inevitable loss. Now he was talking about hope like it was a renewable resource. "Jake, yeah, I love you." It was the first time either of them had said it out loud, though they'd been moving toward it for weeks. Jake stopped throwing the ball and turned to face her surprise and joy, and something that might have been relief crossing his features. "I love you too," he said. "I have for a while now." Max dropped the ball at their feet and looked up at them expectantly. When neither human moved to throw it, he barked once, a sound that seemed to say less talking, more playing. They laughed and Jake threw the ball again. As they watched Max bound after it with unbridled enthusiasm, Sarah realized that this was happiness. Not the dramatic temporary high of achieving some major goal, but the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered, people who cared about you and above who thought you hung the moon. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now," Jake said, "we go home, have some coffee, maybe stop by the bakery and let Mrs. Kim feed us lunch. And then we wait for the next call, and we keep finding lost things and helping them find their way home." Max returned with the ball, but instead of dropping it, he sat down between them and looked from Sarah to Jake and back again. His tail was wagging, his tongue lolling out in a doggy grin, and his eyes held that same intelligent warmth that had first caught Sarah's attention 6 months ago. "What do you think, buddy?" Sarah asked, scratching behind his ears. "Ready to head home," Max barked once, sharp and joyful, and Sarah knew that whatever came next, they'd face it together. All of them, the formerly lost, the temporarily misplaced, and the faithful guide, who'd somehow known all along that the best things in life were worth searching for. 1 year later, the wedding was small, had held in Forest Park on a clear October morning, exactly 1 year after the day Max first went missing. Mrs. Kim had insisted on catering. David had baked the cake, and Benny wore a tiny bow tie that he tolerated with the dignity of a dog who'd learned to accept that humans sometimes had strange ideas about formal occasions. Max, as the unofficial best man, carried the rings in a special pouch attached to his search vest. He'd taken his role seriously, staying close to Jake throughout the ceremony and only getting distracted once when a squirrel ran across the clearing. "Do you, Sarah Chen, take Jake Morrison to be your husband in wilderness and in safety in times of searching and in times of finding?" Sarah looked at Jake, really looked at him. The man who'd taught her that being lost wasn't the end of the story, just the beginning of finding your way to where you were supposed to be. "I do. And do you, Jake Morrison, take Sarah Chen to be your wife, to search alongside and support through every rescue and every homecoming?" Jake's voice was steady and sure. "I do." When they kissed, Max barked his approval, and the small gathering of friends and family cheered. In the back row, David dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief, while Mrs. Kim whispered something to Benny about how this was how love stories were supposed to end. Later at the reception in Mrs. Thomas Kim's bakery, Sarah found herself standing outside on the sidewalk, watching through the window as Jake and David argued good-naturedly about the proper way to cut a wedding cake, while Mrs. Kim supervised and offered unhelpful advice. Max padded up beside her and sat down, leaning his warm weight against her legs. Together, they looked through the window at the people who'd become their family, the found family that comes together not through blood or obligation, but through the shared experience of being lost and finding each other. "Pretty good year, huh, buddy?" Sarah said softly. Max looked up at her with those wise golden eyes, and Sarah could swear she saw him smile. In the distance, she could hear the sound of sirens, fire trucks. Probably, or an ambulance heading to help someone who needed it. Once that sound would have made her anxious, a reminder of all the ways life could go wrong. Now it sounded like possibility. Like people who dedicated their lives to bringing lost things home. Tomorrow, she and Jake would be back at work, responding to calls, following trails, reuniting families with missing loved ones. Max would put his nose to the ground and lead them through whatever wilderness lay ahead, confident in his ability to find what needed finding. But tonight they were home. All of them, the formerly lost, gathered together in a warm circle of light, surrounded by the kind of love that guides you through the darkest forests and leads you back to where you belong. Sarah smiled and headed back inside to rejoin her wedding reception, Max trotting beside her with his tail wagging. Through the window, she could see Jake looking for her, his face lighting up when he spotted her approaching. Some stories end with people riding off into the sunset. Sarah's story ended with people coming home to each other over and over again, choosing love and hope, and the belief that no one has to stay lost forever. It was, she thought, a much better ending.